Who is at Guantanamo anyway? That's what I was wondering one hot day last July when I walked across a prison yard so silent and sterile as to be a little eerie. Nothing grew in the yard, no grass or flower or tree or even weed. We approached a hut. Inside was a man chained to the floor. His name was Adele. My firm had filed a habeas case for him the previous March, but I have never seen him or spoken to him before. Was he a terrorist? One of the worst of the worst? 3 weeks before I got to Guantanamo, Vice President Cheney said the people that are there are people we picked up on the battlefield, primarily in Afghanistan. They're terrorists, they are bomb makers, they are facilitators of terror, they are members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but something was off right from the first minute. Something about the young man's gentle smile. His calm didn't fit. On that day last July, I discovered what President Bush and his lawyers at the Justice Department had kept secret from the public and even from the courts. The military had concluded that Adele was innocent. I repeat, the military had concluded that Adele was innocent already at that point. Not a terrorist, not an enemy soldier, not a criminal. He had never been on a battlefield. He had been sold to U.S. forces from the soil of Pakistan, a nation with whom we had never been at war. Vice President Cheney says that Adele and men like him were picked up on the battlefield, but according to a 2005 study conducted by the Seton Hall School of Law, 5% were picked up on the battlefield. I repeat, 5% of the 780 men who were held at Guantanamo Bay were picked up from the battlefield. 95% of detainees at Guantanamo were not. So how did we get the rest? We distributed leaflets with smiling Afghan individuals declaring, quote, "Get wealth and power beyond your wildest dreams. You can receive millions of dollars helping the anti-Taliban forces catch Al-Qaeda and Taliban murderers. This is enough money to take care of your family, your village, your tribe for the rest of your life. Pay for livestock and doctors and school books and housing for all of your people." 86% of the Guantanamo detainees were sold to the United States by people who got those flyers. Vice President Cheney says that these men are all Al-Qaeda fighters, but what does the data show? 8% are Al-Qaeda fighters, 92% are not. Vice President Cheney says they committed hostile acts against Americans or their allies. What does the data say? 55% of the detainees committed no hostile act against the United States or its allies or anyone else. But by the way, Cheney and other Bush administration officials construed the term hostile act extremely broadly. For example, fleeing from bombing by U.S. forces was considered a hostile act. Being sold to U.S. forces, hostile act. For 60% of the detainees, the only hook by which they were deemed enemy combatants is that they were, quote, associated with the Taliban. But you have to understand that in 2001 in Afghanistan, the Taliban were pervasive, except in a few strongholds of the Northern Alliance. They controlled every village, every town, every guest house. If you traveled to Kabul and stayed in a guest house, you associated with the Taliban, according to the U.S. government. If you were conscripted against your will into a Taliban militia, you, quote, associated with the Taliban. For 2 Saudis held at Guantanamo, their association with the Taliban is that the Taliban held them in prison as enemies of its regime. I am not making this up. Who was at Guantanamo? Who were the 780 that were kept there? They were privates, they were orphans, they were the poor, they were the conscripts, they were the cooks, they were the drivers. What about the mayors, the ministers, the Taliban generals, the people in power who had information? Guess what? They were not there. Because the big lie, the whopper, the huge one, is that Guantanamo Bay held terrorists. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, their amen chorus in the Senate, they will all tell you relentlessly that these people are terrorists, but when you review the data, when you search it for anything remotely like a terrorist attack defined as an act of violence against persons or property for bombing or bomb making or the teaching of bomb making or the fundraising for it, you find that, most of all, that isn't who was at Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay Detention Center is a 45-mile stretch of land the United States has leased from Cuba since the Spanish-American War. After 9/11, President Bush needed a place where due process, the courts, and lawyers could not reach 780 men and boys, many of whom were sold to the U.S. military for a $5,000 bounty. Who and what have we kept at Guantanamo Bay for the last 24 years? Terrorists? No. A legal black hole? Yes. Administration officials believed that by labeling Guantanamo detainees enemy combatants, it could hold them at Guantanamo indefinitely, potentially for life, without charges or a trial. At the same time, the Bush administration made a series of determinations that the prisoners at Guantanamo, as well as others held as enemy combatants in the, quote, global war on terror, were not entitled to any protections under American or international law, including under the Geneva Conventions, which were intended to ensure that no prisoner would be outside the law. If there was anyone at Guantanamo who conspired in the 9/11 murders, then we would have liked to see them tried. All that we lawyers had been asking for since the beginning is a hearing, a chance to show whether someone really is a, quote, enemy combatant or not. And when Guantanamo cases have come up for an actual hearing, what happened after the case came under Supreme Court scrutiny? Well, they released him. They told us that these people were the worst of the worst. And yet, rather than prove it, rather than protect you and me from them, they released them before a judge could see any facts because they knew. The Nazi war criminals were tried in the sunlight, and the world has never doubted the judgment at Nuremberg. But in no Guantanamo habeas case has President Bush been willing to let a federal judge hear a single fact about the worst of the worst. Instead, in the name of, quote, global war on terror, the president can seize anyone, anywhere in the world and transport him to Guantanamo Bay, where he may be held without criminal charge or process. The president may do so even after he has determined that the person was taken by mistake, as in Adele's case, and hold him as long as the, quote, war on terror lasts. So I want to ask you a question. How long will the war on terror last? That is the beginning of an episode I posted 2 years ago on my podcast entitled The President and His Captives, Guantanamo Bay, Torture and the Legal Black Hole. And I am sick to my stomach about the fact that we have to talk about it again. This is what will happen.